42 years ago, a 19-year-old girl finished her night shift at Shawnee and vanished without a trace, leaving her family devastated and the whole town gripped by an unnamed dread. Authorities suspected a man who had been seen lingering near the scene, but with no body, no solid evidence, and no reliable witnesses, the investigation quickly went cold. Still, over the long years that followed, Camila's family never gave up hope, clinging to every tiny piece of evidence: a single left shoe, a red backpack, a scrap of green fabric, like the last fragments of memory holding on to the truth. Then one day, as they re-examined those items under the light of modern technology, a detail overlooked for 4 decades came into view, a detail powerful enough to turn the entire case around and shake the whole community. Before we dive deep into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like this video, don't forget to hit subscribe. On a late summer evening in Shawnee, Oklahoma, the small town was cloaked in an unusual stillness, as if every movement had been held back by the wind across the still hot pavement, retaining the day's heat. The streets stretching along the Kickapoo axis, usually quiet at night, felt even more deserted, with only the neon lights flickering in front of the sooner-stopped convenience store struggling against the spreading darkness. Moisture from strong gusts swept across the parking lot, forming tiny dust devils that swirled up and then dissolved into the night. Against that backdrop, Camila Garcia, 19 years old, left the store after her night shift, pushing open the familiar glass door and stepping into the half-light of the fading blue sign. Nothing seemed unusual in her walk or her breathing, yet a vague unease clung to her, like someone was watching, a low simmer that wasn't quite strong enough to make her truly alert. Camila had joked with coworkers that some strange guy has been hanging around lately, but no one took her seriously. At the edge of the parking lot, where the store lights no longer reached strong enough to illuminate faces clearly, a chance passerby witnessed Camila pause. She stood just a few steps from a man, his shadow slanted across the concrete, next to a dark-colored car parked tight against the curb. They appeared to be talking, but the distance and thick darkness kept the witness from hearing a word, let alone making out facial details or a license plate. It was a moment that lasted only seconds, long enough to lodge in memory, but not long enough for anyone to connect it to danger. In small towns like Shawnee, casual conversations between acquaintances or strangers happen all the time without drawing much attention. When Camila left that spot and continued walking along the road toward the eastern residential area, she gradually melted into the layer of darkness connecting the rows of low houses, far from the neon glow of the store. That was the last image anyone in town ever saw of her still standing on this earth. That night passed in a silence, so quiet it felt wrong. The usual sounds, late cars passing, doors opening, conversations drifting from porches, all vanished, leaving only the wind whistling through metal roofs and tree canopies, slapping against old wooden walls like a vague warning. As time passed without Camila walking through the door as usual, the silence began to tighten around every family member's chest. They called the store, called her close friends, even called people they thought might have run into her on the way, but every answer was the same. No one knew where Camila had gone after her shift. The calls grew more frantic, more urgent, laced with mounting fear with every passing minute. By the time all ordinary possibilities had been ruled out, when the living room clock ticked past an hour, Camila had never come home later than. Unease turned into silent panic. With no other choice left, the family decided to call the police. When the missing person report reached the Shawnee Police Department dispatch in the early morning hours, the night patrol team was immediately dispatched to the area around the store, where Camila was last seen. Patrol lights swept across wet lawns and the empty parking lot, illuminating the dust still clinging to the pavement, where just hours earlier, it had been the intersection of neon glow and Camila's footsteps. Officers began cordoning off the area, marking a short stretch of sidewalk running from the store to the eastern residential neighborhood. This became the last known point of contact, the final spot where Camila appeared before disappearing into the darkness. That road was normally considered safe, but in the late night hours with few people around, it turned into a shadowy transition zone, especially with only 2 streetlights spaced so far apart. that they didn't provide enough illumination to clearly see a person's face. The first officers entered the store to interview the remaining staff from the night shift. One of them said they had briefly glimpsed Camila talking to someone out in the parking lot, but only from inside through the glass door, and not clearly. The witness described the figure as a man wearing a dark-colored jacket, standing with a slight lean, and next to him was a dark-colored vehicle that looked like an old van or truck. There were no specific details, no license plate, no identification, no facial features, just a vague silhouette. Still, that was the first description the police recorded. From there, they began reconstructing the route Camila usually walked home. The asphalt road stretched from the store, past a row of low houses and an empty lot, before turning into the residential area. When shining lights down on the pavement, police discovered a blind spot, more than 20 meters completely without streetlight, because one pole had been broken since the previous winter. That was the first point of suspicion because it created a perfect pocket of darkness for anyone to approach or overpower a victim without being seen. Down at the edge of that road, police started noting faint shoe prints and tire marks on the dirt. The shoe prints weren't clear enough to determine an exact size, and the tire tracks only showed part of the tread pattern. The investigative team couldn't conclude what type of vehicle they belonged to. Nevertheless, they photographed them, measured them, and entered them into the evidence log in case they gained value later. Behind the store, where the ground was softer, they found an additional drag mark, but it was unclear whether it was related or just from routine customer activity. Everything was too vague to draw conclusions, but it was enough to form a hypothesis that the dark-colored vehicle seen there might have headed toward the Tecumseh Woods or toward Tennessee Street. After completing the scene survey, police began compiling a list of everyone who had been in the vicinity within roughly 2 hours around the time Camila left the store. They canvassed residents living nearby, drivers passing through, the last customers of the evening, and people who regularly came to the store late at night. The initial list quickly expanded, from those seen in the area to those with vague alibis or who couldn't prove where they were when Camila disappeared. At the same time, police checked the single camera at the store. The device was old, low resolution, and recorded choppily. In the footage capturing the moment Camila stepped out the door, they could only see the upper part of her, along with faint reflected lights creating a long streak. When slowing down the later segment, a dark-colored vehicle passing through the parking lot appeared in frame, but the image was too grainy to identify the make, model, or license plate. There were also no other camera angles covering the entire area, a major limitation back in the 1980s. Police noted the vehicle in the category object of interest, but it couldn't yet be considered evidence. By the time they sifted through all the information gathered on that first night, they had only 3 clear elements. Camila left the store as usual, she was seen with an unidentified man, and then she vanished on a stretch of road lacking light. No screams, no signs of violence, no clues to indicate which direction she went afterward. To avoid missing any possibility, police decided to expand the investigation immediately, concluding that this disappearance had far more unusual elements than typical cases, and if leads weren't pursued early, the chances of finding Camila would diminish with every passing hour. The next morning, as the first daylight touched the low rooftops around eastern Shawnee, police had already begun expanding the search radius to 1.5 kilometers from the spot where Camila was last seen. This was the direction she usually walked home, a route not long but dotted with intersections, leading into small woods, abandoned lots, and little-used trails. Search teams consisting of patrol officers, volunteers, and K-9 units were divided by direction, combing every patch of ground, bushes, drainage ditches, and turnoffs that could serve as an intermediate spot for an abductor. An atmosphere of urgency enveloped the entire group, because up to that point, they had no indication whatsoever that Camila had left on her own. Every hypothesis pointed toward her having encountered an unusual situation right after leaving the store. The K-9 team was deployed first, starting from the sidewalk where Camila had left the last light. The scent still lingering on the ground allowed the dogs to follow the trail for the initial stretch, extending a few hundred meters farther into a dimly lit section of road. However, When they reached the edge of a large curve leading out to open land, the scent trail abruptly ended. The dogs circled, trying to pick up another direction, but couldn't establish one. To the investigative team, this was a clear sign. Camila had most likely been placed into a vehicle right at this blind spot, consistent with the earlier observation of the dark-colored car near the store. The sudden cutoff of the scent trail reinforced the theory that the victim had not walked any significant distance afterward. While sweeping the area around the point where the scent disappeared, an officer found a small piece of green fabric caught on the edge of an old wooden fence. The fabric wasn't large enough to confirm its origin, but it was collected into an evidence bag because the discovery location was too close to the suspected point of approach on Camila. No one yet knew if the fabric was related, but in a missing person case with so few initial leads, every detail, no matter how small, could become a crucial piece of the puzzle. At the same time, as search teams continued expanding into the eastern residential area, a man living near the corner of Highland provided a new statement. On the night Camila disappeared, he saw a dark-colored vehicle driving unusually slowly around the neighborhood before turning onto a small road next to the woods. The man said he couldn't make out the license plate or the driver's face, but the vehicle's abnormally slow speed had caught his attention. This statement was immediately entered into the file because it matched the initial description from the witness at the store. With two independent accounts, both mentioning a dark-colored vehicle in the same time frame, police had to consider the possibility that this was no longer coincidental behavior. The investigative team proceeded to sketch out possible routes the abductor could have used to leave the area quickly and undetected. They marked three main paths: the turnoff into the Tecumseh Woods, the loop out toward Tennessee Street, and the narrow road leading to the wasteland near Route 18. All of these routes shared common features: lack of lighting, numerous side turns, and the ability to change direction in just seconds. The technical team examined the pavement at each turnoff, noting faint tire marks blurred by the night wind and covered with a layer of dry dust. Although none of the samples were sharp enough to identify a specific vehicle type, the investigative team archived all the photographs for future comparison. When the first search day concluded, the Shawnee map hanging on the command board was thick with small red dots, each one representing a lid, a possible direction, or a location that needed to be revisited more thoroughly. There were no signs suggesting Camila had left town voluntarily, no long trail of footprints leading away, no scattered belongings, like in runaways. Instead, everything pointed to the same unspoken conclusion: this was not a voluntary disappearance, but a deliberate abduction, carried out swiftly, cleanly, and precisely at the spot where light couldn't reach. And in the moment the officers looked back at the summary board, they all understood that missing even one tiny trace could cause the case to slip through their fingers right then and there. The woods near Tecumseh that morning were covered in a thin layer of mist, clinging to the grass and tree trunks like a cold curtain, making every movement of the search team sink into a tense silence. As the team split up to sweep along the trail leading into the forest, one of the volunteers suddenly signaled for the supervising officer to come closer. On the damp ground, between two low bushes, lay a small white and blue athletic shoe, caked with dirt but still recognizable, the kind Camila Garcia usually wore to work. Spotting a piece of the victim's personal belongings in the deserted forest area instantly made the atmosphere heavy. Officers quickly cordoned off the zone, photographed the scene, and marked the location with reflective stakes. The shoe lay straight, undisturbed, with no signs of having been violently yanked off her foot, and what caught their attention most was the complete absence of any drag marks around it. No deep grooves, no long skid trails on the ground, no major disturbance of the dry leaves. All of it suggested that Camila had most likely been forced to walk while still conscious, or at least not dragged by force at this spot. To the investigative team, this was significant. It proved that if she had been brought to this area, she had walked in under her own power, perhaps under someone's control, and was not simply dumped after an on-site attack. As they swept wider around the area, police discovered a series of faint tire marks on the sandy soil, a few meters from the shoe's position. Although most of the impressions had faded due to wind and the soft earth, The partial tread patterns on the few remaining marks indicated they matched tires commonly used on old trucks or vans, particularly models manufactured from the late 1970s to the early 1980s. This detail stood out because it aligned with the descriptions of the dark-colored vehicle multiple witnesses had seen on the night Camila disappeared. However, the tire marks were incomplete in many sections, not enough to confirm a specific make or tire type, so police could only log it as an unverified lead. The location where the shoe was found lay in a blind zone that the search team from the previous day hadn't yet covered. The forest entrance was obscured by wide tree canopies and an old tilted roadside sign, so the area hadn't been considered a primary approach route in the initial search. It was only when the search radius expanded and investigators recognized routes the abductor might have used to leave the disappearance site that this zone was added to the plan. Even more noteworthy, from the shoe's location one could go deeper into the woods or turn toward the wasteland, lying between segments of the Tecumseh Road, exactly the spot where another witness had reported seeing the dark-colored vehicle turn in. This coincidence began to form a clearer picture in the investigators' minds. One officer crouched to examine the flattened soil right next to the shoe, speculating that someone might have stood there for a while, or deliberately placed the shoe down. The neatness of the evidence, combined with the lack of struggle marks around it, forced them to ask, was Camila attacked right here in the woods, or was the shoe simply a piece left behind by the abductor to mislead searchers about the timing and path of the victim? Though they couldn't answer yet, one thing was certain: the shoe's appearance in that spot was not random. When they pieced together all the elements, the faint tire marks, Camila's left shoe, statements about the dark-colored vehicle driving slowly around the neighborhood, and the K9 scent trail cutting off abruptly at the road's edge, police saw more and more leads converging in the same direction. Camila had not left Shawnee voluntarily, but had been forced to move to this place. The abduction hypothesis, once just a fringe possibility, was now becoming the primary line of investigation. But there was one major problem: not a single clue could be directly linked to any specific suspect on the current list. The tire marks couldn't be traced. The green fabric scrap found the previous day still had no identified origin, and the witnesses describing the dark-colored vehicle gave descriptions too vague to point to anyone in particular. Even though Rick Donnelly, the 28-year-old electrician, had made the list because he was frequently seen around the store area, his alibi for the night Camila disappeared temporarily cleared him from suspicion. No one on the investigative team knew that decision would stretch the case's resolution by decades. Once the forest scene was fully marked and evidence collected, the lead investigator stood quietly for a moment, gazing down the road leading into the dense silent woods. Every step the search team took here showed that Camila hadn't vanished by accident. She had been brought to this place, no one knew how, but the presence of the shoe said what the whole town wasn't yet ready to accept: a human hand was behind this. And if the abductor could act that fast, right in the overlooked shadows, then the chances of finding Camila alive were diminishing by the hour. Yet they still couldn't identify a suspect, couldn't track down the vehicle, couldn't tie any clue to anyone. By the third day of the expanded search, a new piece of information came in from a resident living along Tennessee Street, the road that loops around the southern part of town and connects straight to the neighborhood where Camila lived. This person reported seeing a vehicle matching Camila's car parked on the curb since the previous evening, but figured it might belong to someone familiar in the area, and didn't report it right away. When officers arrived to check, Camila's car was right there at the far end of the quiet stretch, parked so neatly that it didn't fit any scenario of chaos or emergency. The morning sunlight hit the light dusting of dirt on the windshield, showing the car had been there for at least several hours, with no signs of anyone touching it after it was parked. To the investigators, that was the first red flag. The parking spot was too perfect, aligned straight with the curb edge, wheels not turned, and no scrapes or dents on the body. It didn't look like a car abandoned in panic. It looked like a car placed there on purpose. As they examined closer, Camila's car door showed no signs of forced entry or tampering. The lock was intact, the handle unscratched, the door frame undamaged. Everything indicated that whoever left the car here had a key, or Camila had unlocked it herself before being controlled. Police opened the car and began checking the interior. Inside was clean with no signs of a struggle, seats not shifted, items not tossed around, dashboard untouched. This further reinforced the view that Camila wasn't attacked right in the car, or if she was, the control happened very quickly and very deliberately. But what caught their attention most was the absence of two important things: Camila's purse and all her identification papers. She always carried her purse to work, with her wallet, driver's license, spare keys, and a few personal items inside. The complete disappearance of the purse forced police to consider two possibilities. The abductor took the purse to dispose of it, or to mislead the timeline, or Camila was forced into a second vehicle, without time to grab any belongings. Neither possibility was positive. As they continued scanning every detail, one officer spotted a small piece of tape stuck to the edge of the passenger side door. The tape was only a few centimeters long, dusted over, and very easy to miss without close inspection. It wasn't conclusive at the time, and was collected under standard procedure, not sent for analysis right away since it lacked direct relevance. However, in the context of the green fabric scrap found in the woods and tire marks matching an old van or truck, this detail was noted in the report as evidence to revisit later. Once the investigative team finished examining the car, they began reconstructing how it could have been brought to Tennessee Street. The straight parking, no misalignment, no collisions with any objects, showed the driver was calm, had time, and wasn't under pressure from pursuit. The driver could have been Camila herself, if she was lured or forced to drive, but then controlled as soon as she stopped. Or the abductor, using her key, drove it here and left it to mislead. Both scenarios led to the same conclusion: Camila did not park the car here on her own. Tennessee Street wasn't her usual route, it was completely off the path she took home. The car's appearance in this spot, in near-perfect condition, felt like part of a plan. When retracing the route from the store to Tennessee Street, police noted at least 3 intersections with no cameras, no witnesses, and long stretches of darkness. Among them, one point lay near the Tecumseh Woods, where the left shoe was found. The more they connected the details, the more they realized the incident was no longer just unusual. The separate clues were starting to link into a chain: the abruptly ending scent trail, the left shoe left in the woods, tire marks from an old van type, statements about the dark-colored vehicle in the neighborhood, and now Camila's car parked neatly as if staged. No evidence yet pointed directly to a specific suspect, but each detail pulled the case away from initial guesses that Camila had left town on her own, or had a minor accident. The scene evidence no longer hid what the investigative team was starting to feel: the incident had pattern, preparation, and the hand of someone actively controlling events from start to finish. When they finished checking the car and sent the report back to headquarters, the lead investigators signed off on redirecting the case. Camila Garcia was officially classified as a missing person suspected of abduction. This was no longer a routine disappearance. This was a deliberate act, carried out by someone who knew the area well, knew how to avoid detection, and was bold enough to manipulate the scene as they wanted. But even with the investigation's scope more clearly defined, the distance to a suspect remained as hazy as the mist covering the Tecumseh Woods that morning. Able to see only shadows, not yet able to touch the truth hidden beneath. As all the traces gathered from Tennessee Street and the Tecumseh Woods gradually came together into the first pieces of the puzzle, the investigative team decided to focus on one essential task: identifying the individuals who could have had access to Camila during the time she left the store. Based on statements from employees, customers, neighbors in the area, and people who had been seen near Sooner Stop in the weeks leading up to the incident, a preliminary list of 9 suspects was compiled. This was not a list of accusations, but a foundation for screening possible connections that could lead to the chain of events behind the disappearance. In that list, the name Rick Donnelly stood out because of his frequent presence around the store. Rick worked as an electrician, often repairing systems in the area, and was seen quite regularly in the parking lot during late afternoons. He was quiet, described by many as gentle and unremarkable. When contacted for questioning, Rick stated that he had been helping his brother fix a garage all evening, while Camila left the store. The two corroborated each other's accounts, and a nearby neighbor reported seeing lights on in the garage during the corresponding time frame. That chain of details was recorded as a fairly solid alibi, so Rick was prioritized for verification, but not placed at the center of the investigation. The next three names were male customers who had been at Sooner Stop in the 2 hours before and after Camila's shift. This group received close scrutiny because they were in the closest proximity to the victim and in a space that could easily allow direct contact. The first was a delivery driver who stopped to buy water and left a clearly time-stamped receipt. The second was a resident living just west of the store, who habitually came in to buy small items in the evening. The third was a young man who had repeatedly annoyed staff by standing too close to the cash register. All three were interviewed separately. The first two provided fairly clear accounts of their movements, backed by witnesses who confirmed their presence elsewhere shortly after leaving the store. The third initially appeared flustered and gave inconsistent answers, but police were able to verify footage of him at a shop nearly a mile from Sooner Stop, right around the time Camila finished her shift. Despite his suspicious behavior, the verified information ruled him out of the time frame. Another person given serious consideration was Camila's ex-boyfriend, since any personal conflict could potentially escalate into serious trouble. He came to the police station willingly and stated that he had been attending a group meeting at church with several acquaintances that evening. Church attendance records and confirmations from other attendees showed he had no opportunity to contact Camila that night. The remaining names on the list were three individuals who had passed through the area, noted by various witnesses. Each was interviewed and had their timeline compared. None matched the image of the man seen standing next to Camila in the parking lot. The biggest problem wasn't the number of suspects, but the quality of the description police had to work with. The sole witness who saw Camila talking to a man could only provide the most general characteristics: dark-colored jacket, average build, dark-colored car parked nearby. No license plate, no facial identification, not even an estimated age. When this description was placed alongside the 9 people on the list, all of them fit at an overly broad level, yet none matched with enough specificity to narrow the field. Each could have been the person who approached Camila, or each could have been completely unrelated. The investigative team continued cross-checking schedules, travel habits, occupations, behavioral histories, and locations where each person had been in the days leading up to the incident. But no single factor pointed to a clear direction. There was no history of violence, no similar prior offenses, no known threats or public disputes with Camila. Meanwhile, the physical evidence around the Tecumseh Woods and Tennessee Street still could not be directly linked to any individual on the list. The left shoe, tire marks, green fabric scrap, the staged position of the car, all remained puzzle pieces that led to no specific human shape. When the internal report was compiled at the end of the day, the prevailing feeling in the investigative team's meeting room was one of heaviness. They had 9 names, but not a single one truly stood out. They had a witness description, but it was far too vague. They had physical evidence, but the pieces still lay scattered. And from the moment the suspect list was finalized, one truth began to emerge. The investigation had no shortage of starting points, yet it lacked a clear path forward. The only thing they were certain of was that whoever approached Camila had left no distinct mark behind. A terrifying silence, like the darkness that had swallowed the young woman whole without making a single sound. When the list of 9 suspects was finalized, the investigative team began revisiting every piece of witness testimony in hopes of finding additional details to narrow the direction of pursuit. But instead of bringing clarity, the statements started to contradict each other in ways that threw the entire map of inferences off course. The sole witness who saw Camila standing next to a man in a dark-colored vehicle on the night she disappeared initially described the vehicle as resembling an old van or truck, based on the height of the body and the thickness of the shadow it cast. However, when asked a second time to provide more details, a second witness, the one living near the store, said the dark-colored vehicle he saw driving around the neighborhood looked more like a large sedan, longer and much lower to the ground, than a van. Both described the car as dark-colored, but they differed completely on the type. This was the most troublesome contradiction, because if it was a van, it fit perfectly with the tire marks found in the Tecumseh woods. If it was a sedan, the entire argument about an old truck or van could collapse. The investigative team spent hours just trying to analyze the plausibility of each description, but in the end, they couldn't conclude which version was more accurate. Another issue arose from the first witness's statement about the man standing next to Camila. In the initial interview, the witness said the man seemed to be talking gently with the girl, but when questioned again to clarify his behavior, the description suddenly shifted. The man had a slightly rushed attitude, as if wanting Camila to walk faster. This small difference was enough to completely change the initial assessment. The original statement suggested they might have known each other or were having a normal conversation. The later statement implied potential coercion. Police had to decide which version of the witness to rely on, but with human memory blurred by time, every analysis became uncertain. These two contradictions led the investigative team to prioritize examining routes heading south of the city, where residents claimed to have seen a dark-colored sedan driving slowly on the exact night Camila disappeared. However, this direction completely diverged from the chain of physical evidence. The Tecumseh woods lay to the east, where the left shoe was found. Tennessee Street was to the northwest, where Camila's car was discovered. Yet in an effort to respond to every piece of information from the community, police still decided to allocate resources to check the southern area, and this became a turning point that significantly scattered the investigation. Over the next 10 days, more than half the manpower was redirected to the southern area to search abandoned houses, empty warehouses, old parking lots, and side roads. They collected more statements, but no physical evidence connected to the disappearance. Every report ended with the same conclusion: no signs that Camila had ever been there. While resources were pulled away from the truly critical areas, initial leads around the Tecumseh woods were delayed in processing. Tire tracks weren't properly preserved due to wind and light rain over several days, and the green fabric scrap still hadn't been analyzed, because investigative priority was now on the southern route. Moreover, the suspect list itself was affected. With the investigation shifting toward the dark-colored sedan, suspects who owned old trucks or vans gradually had their relevance downgraded, including Rick Donnelly. His alibi, which had already been preliminarily confirmed, was now seen as even more solid, leading to his removal from priority status after just 2 cross-checks. No one realized that this elimination would remove the chance to later spot anomalies in Rick's statements. When the investigative team summarized progress on the 10th day, one clear truth emerged: there was no evidence whatsoever confirming that the dark-colored sedan was related to the disappearance, while the most important traces still lay to the east, where the left shoe appeared, and where tire marks were imprinted on the ground. But the investigative team had spent nearly 2 weeks just to prove one thing: the southern direction was completely wrong. Those days brought 2 major consequences. The Tecumseh woods evidence faded further, and the suspect list was filtered in the most disadvantageous way. The discrepancies in witness statements, combined with pressure to respond to community information, caused the entire investigation to veer off the only path that had any real potential to lead to the abductor. The case, once a clear chain of leads, had begun to go off track, opening a period where any wrong decision could push the truth decades further away. When the investigative direction toward the dark-colored sedan was ruled out, and the team returned to re-examine the scene around Sooner Stop, a previously overlooked detail began to draw attention. Faint machine oil streaks on the parking lot, stretching into 3 small connected spots like drops that had fallen from the undercarriage of a vehicle. The technical unit was called in to collect samples and analyze them. The results showed this wasn't ordinary motor oil, but a specialized industrial lubricant, typically used for electrical equipment, air compressors, or specialized engines in technical work. This type of oil rarely appeared in everyday personal vehicles. The finding created particular interest within the investigative group, because it unexpectedly narrowed the scope of vehicles potentially involved in the case. If the vehicle that approached Camila in the parking lot had left those traces, it could belong to someone working in electrical mechanics or industrial technical fields, a profession that wasn't overly common in the town of Shawnee at the time. The analysis results forced the investigative team to revisit the entire suspect list. A few names immediately stood out. 3 individuals on the list were connected to technical jobs, including Rick Donnelly, the local electrician, who had previously been deprioritized solely because his statements aligned and an alibi had been superficially confirmed. However, the rare machine oil was only an indirect clue. It couldn't be used to accuse anyone. The lead investigator ordered that this factor not be overlooked, but also not treated as a primary lead. The technical team continued checking the pavement and grassy edges along the parking lot. They discovered tire impressions pressed into the soil that did not match any tread pattern from the tires on Camila's own car. The impressions had a wider width and deeper grooves, characteristic of small trucks or older vans. This discovery reinforced the earlier speculation from the faint tire marks in the Tecumseh woods. A second vehicle had been involved in the disappearance. The big question was, who did that second vehicle belong to? To answer it, the investigative team requested that the analysis division compile a list of all truck and van models manufactured between 1978 and 1983 that had appeared or been registered in Shawnee and the surrounding area. A map listing dozens of vehicle types, along with production years and compatible tire specifications, was posted on the board. Many models could have produced similar tire impressions: older Chevy G-Series, Ford Econoline, late-model Dodge Tradesman, were commonly used by technical workers, electricians, air conditioning repairmen, or building maintenance crews. When this vehicle list was compared to the suspect list, the investigative team realized 3 people on it owned or had access to vehicles in that category. But when additional information was gathered, no direct evidence placed any of those vehicles at the disappearance scene. Investigators tried to retrace each vehicle's movements through statements, repair receipts, and information from previous owners. All had gaps, but none of the gaps were sufficient to tip the scales toward the vehicle owners. The impasse became clearest when the investigative team began cross-referencing the rare machine oil with the suspects who had technical vehicles. Industrial oil could, in theory, have come from any source: a repair shop, a job site, spilled equipment, or even the store itself if someone had carried related items. No oil samples were found in the vehicles of the key suspects. Meanwhile, Camila's left shoe still showed no physical correlation to any of those questioned. Some investigators began to suspect the disappearance might involve someone not on the original suspect list, someone just passing through town who acted on impulse. But suddenly shifting focus entirely to strangers risked overlooking critical leads. Debates stretched across multiple meetings, and every direction led to difficult gaps. The investigative team tried reconstructing the timeline based on facts. Camila left the store, talked to an unidentified man, vanished in the blind zone. The left shoe appeared in the Tecumseh woods, then her car was left deliberately staged on Tennessee Street. The rare machine oil and van tire marks seemed to make the picture clearer, but the key piece was missing: the driver of the second vehicle. Even though intuition suggested a connection between the industrial oil, the old van, and one of the suspects familiar with technical work, no document or statement ever linked those 3 elements together. Each piece stood alone, but could not stand together. That was what plunged the investigation into darkness. Every lead had direction, but none converged. The summary report at the end of the week showed the investigative team had to acknowledge a hard reality. There was no direct evidence strong enough to swing the case toward any specific suspect. The rare machine oil created suspicion, but couldn't confirm a vehicle owner. The tire marks confirmed a second vehicle's existence, but didn't identify its owner. The truck-van map helped narrow the field, but created no connections, and though those signs redirected suspicion back toward a few names, especially those in technical professions, everything remained stalled. A sense of helplessness gradually spread through the investigative group, as if they stood before a locked door with no one knowing where the key was. Camila's disappearance still had no face, no motive, no clear path. And amid a series of seemingly promising leads, the investigative map still lacked the most important position: the person who took Camila away. The following weeks passed in the quiet exhaustion of the investigative team. Search teams continued sweeping the areas around the Tecumseh Woods, Tennessee Street, and the roads on either side, but no new traces ever appeared. No one in the neighborhood reported hearing screams, no other personal items were found, and no witnesses provided any additional useful details. Those who had seen the dark-colored vehicle repeated the same vague descriptions, and the witness who saw the man standing next to Camila couldn't add any further identifying features. The stalemate spread like the thick fog that blanketed the Tecumseh Woods every early morning. There were no signs of violence on Camila's car, no blood, no drag marks at any scene, and no clear sequence of movement sufficient to form an identifiable route. An abduction usually leaves at least some sign of resistance, a small physical trace, or a witness who heard something unusual. But this case felt as though an invisible hand had been placed over the entire scene, covering every clue from the very first moment. The complete absence of traces left every hypothesis hanging between possibility and doubt. In the 3 months that followed, Camila Garcia's case file recorded no meaningful breakthroughs. Periodic reports added a few lines about rechecking areas, verifying information, re-interviewing old witnesses, but all ended with the same conclusion: no progress. The investigative team could not prove that Camila had left on her own, yet they also lacked concrete evidence to confirm she had been abducted. Even the rare clues like the industrial machine oil and the truck van tire marks could not be developed further, because no other evidence stood alongside them to form a logical chain. Every piece remained isolated, untouched by the others. Police tried reconstructing Camila's movements in the days leading up to the incident, where she worked, the routes she usually took, the people she met, her personal habits. Everything pointed to an ordinary life with no signs of trouble, no debts, no shady relationships, no contact with anyone who had a criminal record. Her disappearance had no apparent cause guiding it. That was what made the case mysterious in the most inexplicable way. Numerous meetings were held, and each time the investigators revisited the original list of 9 suspects. On paper, 3 had been near sooner stop, 2 were regular customers, 1 had annoyed staff before, 1 was the ex-boyfriend, and 1 was the electrician, with a fully corroborated alibi. But when police compared every detail, they found nothing strong enough to charge anyone. No one had a clear motive, no one was caught lying about their whereabouts, and no one had physical evidence directly tied to Camila. Meanwhile, the abduction suspicion, though it fit the rapid disappearance and the deliberately staged car, still could not be proven to legal standards. No witness saw force being used, no traces showed Camila being dragged into a vehicle, no evidence indicated anyone had applied violence to her. The K9 scent trail cutting off abruptly was the only thing that made police believe Camila had been placed into a vehicle, but that alone could not form an indictment. Furthermore, the inability to identify the route the perpetrator used made the picture fragmented: the Tecumseh Woods to the east, Tennessee Street to the northwest, the neighborhood in between, and no movement pattern solid enough to reconstruct the offender's actions, if there truly was an offender. After 3 months with no new leads whatsoever, Command decided to place Camila Garcia's case into inactive status. This did not mean the case was forgotten, but the official force no longer maintained a full-time investigative team. Only one investigator was assigned to monitor for any new information that might arise. The decision was made amid heaviness and helplessness, a disappearance filled with suspicion, with enough signs of deliberate intervention, yet unable to cross the minimum threshold of proof. On paper, all hypotheses remained open. In reality, every path led to a dead end, and in that thick fog of uncertainty, the biggest question still had no answer. If this was not an abduction, then what had caused Camila Garcia to vanish from Shawnee without leaving a single trace? Time continued to pass without bringing any hope to the disappearance of Camila Garcia. Investigative efforts over 3 consecutive months produced no breakthroughs, causing the case to gradually sink beneath dozens of new incidents arising in the town and surrounding areas. By 1985, After numerous internal meetings and assessments of resource allocation capabilities, the Shawnee Police Department reached a difficult but almost inevitable decision: transfer the entire Camila Garcia case file to the cold case storage, where unsolved cases with archival value were kept for potential future review when new technology, information, or statements emerged. The case was closed not because answers had been found, but because no further progress was possible with what was available. When the file was transferred, all evidence collected from the early days, the left shoe, the green fabric scrap, the blurry camera images, reports on the rare machine oil streaks, tire marks in the woods, statements about Camila's car being deliberately placed on Tennessee Street, was moved to the Technical Division's evidence storage, but evidence preservation standards at the time were still limited, lacking regular inspection procedures and tight oversight, like in later decades. Some items were sealed improperly, others were stored in unsuitable packaging, increasing the risk of deterioration, contamination, or cross-contamination over time. A 1990 inventory report later showed that at least 3 pieces of evidence related to Camila had been stored below standard, right from when they entered cold case storage. Those errors were not intentional, but reflected the common reality in small American police departments during the 1980s. Lack of specialized personnel, lack of budget, and lack of standardized long-term evidence preservation requirements. Not only physical evidence was affected, witness statements suffered the same fate. During a file review at the end of 1985, the document clerk discovered many handwritten notes mixed into files from other missing person cases. Some statements were mistakenly attached to evidence folders, while several short reports about witnesses who had seen the dark-colored vehicle ended up in unrelated document drawers. These mix-ups did not invalidate the file's value, but they made the case even harder to track if anyone wanted to reopen it in the future. The investigative team carefully noted everything, but every line and every page conveyed the same truth: no one wanted to face. There was no sign whatsoever that Camila was still alive. No letters, no strange phone calls, no acquaintance who had seen her anywhere in the 2 years after she vanished. If Camila had left town voluntarily, she had done so in a way that left absolutely no trace, and that ran completely counter to her personality and living circumstances. No one believed that theory, but when every investigative avenue was blocked, the official report had no choice but to state voluntary departure by the victim cannot be ruled out despite lack of evidence. Among the original suspects, many were gradually cleared from the file because they no longer fit the case developments, or because they had rock-solid alibis. Those who had merely passed through the area were verified. Camila's ex-boyfriend was fully eliminated. The 3 male customers who had been in the store were no longer relevant, and even those with old vans or trucks were no longer under surveillance. Among them, the most notable was Rick Donnelly, the one included on the suspect list only because of his frequent presence near Sooner Stop and his work in the technical field. Rick's alibi, confirmed by family and neighbors, was recorded in the file as strong enough evidence to mark him as not involved in the archived version. This happened quietly, with no objections and no further questions, because at the time no evidence contradicted that alibi. If Rick had been involved, he had concealed it without leaving any clear trace, and if his alibi was false, no one in the force had the tools to uncover it. When the final lines of the report were written, Camila Garcia's case was officially tagged with temporarily closed status. Not solved, not concluded with specifics, just the end of a process that could go no further. Camila's file was placed in the cold case drawer, marked with a yellow sheet of paper, and quietly slid into the darkness of storage. Beyond the photo of Camila on the file, and a few old newspaper clippings mentioning the mysterious disappearance, nothing in the documents showed that a case had once shaken this small town, and with each passing month, the memory of the 19-year-old girl who vanished one summer night faded in the minds of many. The case was not completely forgotten, but it no longer flowed in the active current of the Shawnee Police Department. When the file was consigned to the cold case vault, all that remained was an unfinished story, locked away by the absence of leads, and the absolute silence of the darkness that had swallowed Camila Garcia whole. 14 years after Camila Garcia disappeared, and her file was placed in cold case storage, the Tecumseh woods still held on to their unreadable stillness, thick old canopies, layers of decayed leaves like a sound-absorbing mat, and trails used only sporadically by locals during hunting season. On an early fall morning in 1997, a hunter from Shawnee, who had been familiar with this stretch of forest for nearly 3 decades, spotted a dark red object standing out against the carpet of yellow leaves. He thought it was a forgotten hunting bag, but when he bent down, the coating of dirt, dust and water stains showed it had been there a long time. It was a red backpack, faded and frayed at many seams, but still recognizable as a style common in the 1980s. The hunter tried opening the backpack, and within seconds of looking inside, his heart sank. It wasn't hunting gear, it wasn't trash, it wasn't something a group of kids had dumped. Inside were 3 items all too familiar from missing persons cases: a simple black hair clip, a partially used roll of silver duct tape, and a faded receipt with almost illegible writing, only a few incomplete numbers still readable. Unease rose immediately, because even without a name, no identification, no direct traces, the backpack carried something that fit too perfectly with the story that had haunted Shawnee. The disappearance of Camila Garcia in 1983. The hunter brought the backpack to the police station that same day, and the news was quickly forwarded to the cold case unit. The backpack was taken to the technical room for examination. However, DNA testing technology in 1997 was still basic. Extracting samples from small items like an old hair clip or used duct tape was nearly impossible. Any potential biological material inside the backpack was too degraded, too contaminated, or too deteriorated to separate cleanly. Technical limitations turned the red backpack into suggestive evidence rather than conclusive proof. The cold case team began examining each item inside. The hair clip wasn't rare, but it matched the style Camila often used according to family accounts. The roll of duct tape was harder to explain. Why would it be in the backpack of a girl with no job, no habit, or no reason to carry such a tool? The old receipt had a few faint numbers, but no store name, no date, nothing clear enough to trace its origin. Yet the strangest thing wasn't the items inside, but the location where the backpack was found. That spot was completely off Camila's usual walking route home from Sooner Stop. It wasn't near where her left shoe had been found in 1983. It wasn't on Tennessee Street. It wasn't close to any area marked on the old investigation map. In other words, the backpack appeared in a place with no reason for Camila to have ever passed through, and even less reason for it to have lain there undetected for 14 years, while the hunter's trail was a long-established path. Investigators immediately raised a question no one wanted to consider: had the backpack been there since 1983, or had it only been placed recently? There was no technology to determine exactly when it hit the ground, but the degree of fabric rot and paper decomposition suggested 2 conflicting possibilities. Even if the backpack was decades old, that didn't prove it had been in that spot since Camila vanished. Someone could have kept it, then returned it to the scene when they felt safe or wanted to mislead. This opened a chilling hypothesis that shook the entire cold case team. Had someone been following the investigation's progress over the years and deliberately placed the backpack in the woods to create the impression of overlooked evidence? When they studied the map closely, investigators realized the backpack's location was near a side branch of the trail, a branch not included in the initial 1983 search because it was considered too narrow, with limited visibility and little use. If the abductor knew the forest terrain, he could easily hide evidence in a place no one would think to look. But the backpack's late appearance made every inference more complicated. Had it been placed there at some point during the past 14 years? If so, that was a sign the perpetrator was still in the area, or at least still following the case. The backpack was added to the list of key evidence, and the file was immediately annotated: full case re-evaluation required. Re-evaluation did not mean a full reopening of the investigation, but it allowed investigators to re-examine every old detail through a fresh lens, especially with new evidence surfacing after years of silence. In an internal report, one investigator noted, if the backpack was placed after search teams stopped operating, it means the perpetrator wanted us to find it. The question is why? The backpack's appearance didn't bring the case closer to an answer, but it pulled the file out of its long sleep. Questions left unfinished since 1983 resurfaced in meetings. Was Camila taken in a van? Why was her car left so neatly? Why no signs of violence? Why only one shoe found? And who might own duct tape, technical equipment, and the habit of concealing evidence? As cold case investigators flipped through old report pages, the name Rick Donnelly reappeared on the original suspect list, but crossed out in blue ink, with the note alibi fits beside it. No one knew how thoroughly that note had been verified. No one knew if the neighbors confirming the alibi had told the full truth. But at the time the backpack was found, Rick was still not considered a potential threat. Although the red backpack brought no answers, it brought something more important, a reason to revive the Camila Garcia case, at least in re-evaluation status. And in the world of cold cases, sometimes all it takes is one piece of evidence rising from the shadows to set everything in motion again. The appearance of the red backpack in the Tecumseh woods once again brought Camila Garcia's file out of storage, and by 2002, when the Shawnee Police Department hired a new investigator for the cold case unit, her disappearance became one of the first files he wanted to revisit. Not because this file held more promise than others, but because of the way it had been left hanging with far too many unanswered questions. With stacks of fragmented reports, improperly stored evidence, and scattered witness statements, he began the re-review process, using the modern investigative method of digging deep into every old piece, not examining each detail in isolation, but cross-referencing every point dismissed as unimportant in 1983 against new context and capabilities. The first thing he did was revisit the original list of 9 suspects. Those cleared by clear alibis or matching statements were moved to a reference category. However, 2 names made him pause longer than the rest: the young man who had once annoyed staff at the store, and Rick Donnelly, the electrician marked not involved in the old file. For the young man, simply cross-checking his movements and confirming witnesses from other stores was enough to rule him out during the critical time window. But with Rick, the new investigator felt something didn't add up. Rick's alibi record relied entirely on statements from family and one neighbor, neither of which had been verified by any independent means. No repair receipts for the garage, no records of purchased parts, no logged electricity usage in the garage, no third-party unfamiliar witness to confirm, and no precise timeline of when Rick left or was present at the supposed alibi location. Those details, in 1983, could have been considered trustworthy enough in a small town, but by 2002 investigative standards, they represented a suspicious gap. The new investigator immediately noted, Rick's alibi needs re-verification to modern standards. However, that verification hit obstacles right away. The neighbor had moved away from Shawnee years earlier, and left no contact information. Rick's brother still lived in the area, but no longer remembered exactly which day they had worked on the garage. His memory of an event nearly 2 decades prior had faded to the point of being unreliable. The investigator tried to find any remaining physical traces, but the garage had been fully renovated, leaving no evidence that could confirm activity on the night Camila disappeared. Re-examining Rick's statement only raised doubts, but those doubts could not be converted into evidence. In addition, the case's most important pieces of evidence, the left shoe, the green fabric scrap, the red backpack, the faded receipt, the silver duct tape roll, all lacked usable DNA according to 2002 technology. They remained untestable, unidentifiable fragments insufficient to charge anyone. Still, the new investigator continued checking one other point, the dark-colored vehicle tied to the 2 initial vague statements. He tried tracing registration records for trucks, vans, and even older sedans in the Shawnee area, from the late 1970s to the early 1980s. Hundreds of plates had been retired, vehicles scrapped, sold, or transferred ownership, or no longer existed. Since 1983 had no traffic cameras, reconstructing that vehicle's movements was nearly impossible. Even cross-referencing tire types from the marks in the Tecumseh woods yielded no new leads, because the impressions had already faded almost completely by the time they were documented and could not be used to pinpoint a specific model. At the end of the review report, the investigator wrote one short line, unable to trace the dark-colored vehicle from any remaining archived data sources. Once again, Camila Garcia's case stood before the harsh truth. The pieces still could not be assembled into a complete picture. No one on the suspect list was suspicious enough to become a direct investigative target. No evidence could advance even one step with current analytical technology. No new witnesses emerged. No additional statements surfaced. The re-review only clarified one thing. The original file had missed something, but no one knew where it lay, in which line of text, or buried under which piece of evidence. Rick Donnelly, despite the small hole exposed in his alibi, still could not be moved into active suspect status. Every other detail worked against any effort to draw conclusions, and because there was no real progress, Camila Garcia's file was once again returned to cold case storage, this time accompanied by a thicker set of notes, but no breakthrough potential. The final line of the 2002 report read, "Case remains temporarily closed, pending new technology or information." In 2011, when a group of criminology students from the University of Central Oklahoma collaborated with the Shawnee Police Department to review several long-standing cold cases, Camila Garcia's disappearance was brought back to the desk as a practical analysis exercise. Among the items proposed for re-examination was the detail about the old van or truck vaguely noted in the 1983 and 2002 files. One student raised a simple but crucial question: do any of the original suspects who owned vans still have those vehicles? That question led the investigative team to retrieve old vehicle registration information. When they checked records for vehicles owned by Rick Donnelly in the early 1980s, police discovered he had once used a 1978 Chevrolet van, exactly the type capable of producing tread patterns similar to the impressions recorded in the Tecumseh woods. The van had been sold many years earlier, and transfer records showed it had passed through 5 different owners. Tracking the vehicle's journey became a lengthy search effort, but no one wanted to overlook a detail that might open a new direction. After nearly 3 months of cross-checking registration logs, locating former owners through mailing addresses, tax records and repair shops, the investigative team finally reached the 5th owner, a man living on the outskirts of Norman. When police contacted him, he agreed to let them inspect the vehicle, even though it was in severely deteriorated condition and had sat immobile in his backyard for years. The van's doors were rusted, the floor warped, the interior rotted, but it was still recognizable as the dark green Chevrolet G-Series once registered under Rick Donnelly's name. The technical team conducted a forensic examination of the van. Despite the corrosion from time, they noted several details that had not been completely destroyed: the ceiling near the passenger side roof ribbing, the rear bench seat that had long been removed, and the inner panel of the sliding door. On the ceiling, right along the metal rib, one investigator found a tiny fragment of silver duct tape still adhering. The tape was old, dry, and brittle, but identifiable as industrial-grade reinforced tape, similar to the type found in the red backpack in 1997. The fragment was sampled and sealed according to proper technical standards and marked as potential evidence. As they continued the inspection, the team found a small piece of green fabric caught under the rear seat track, only half a fingernail in size, but the color and texture were strikingly similar enough to draw attention. Thick, coarse fabric, matching the green scrap found near the location of Camila's left shoe in 1983. To confirm a connection between the two fabric pieces, the technical unit would need fiber analysis, but the van was too old, and most of the interior had been altered or rotted, making context difficult to establish. The fabric was collected as secondary evidence, since it could not yet be confirmed whether it had been present during Rick's ownership or belonged to a later owner. However, the simultaneous presence of the duct tape fragment and the green fabric scrap inside the same vehicle once owned by an original suspect caused the case, long shrouded in silence, to suddenly show a crack worth noticing. Even so, hope was quickly tempered when the technical team attempted biological testing. No DNA was found inside the van, no blood traces, no usable fingerprints, no biological samples remained intact enough for analysis. Nearly 3 decades had erased any possibility of finding direct traces from the victim or perpetrator. The investigator noted in the report, the duct tape fragment and green fabric piece represent the first physical evidence link that could connect Rick Donnelly to the chain of events before the case went cold. However, no biological data supports a conclusion. In other words, the van contained pieces that fit Camila's case file, but lacked the confirming element to prove involvement. Inside the meeting room, as they compiled the newly recovered evidence, the cold case team debated the value of this discovery. Some investigators argued that the coincidence between the items in the van and the scattered evidence from the disappearance was too significant to ignore. Others cautioned that the passage of many years and multiple owners made everything potentially coincidental. No one in the group dared declare this incriminating evidence, but everyone agreed it was the first time in nearly 3 decades that a physical connection, even small, had emerged between a previously dismissed suspect and traces from the disappearance. When the final report was completed, the file still could not be formally reopened, but investigators added a rare note at the bottom of the page. If evidence analysis technology advances further in the future, the 1978 Chevrolet van should be prioritized for re-examination, and that old rusted, dust-covered time-rotted van became the only silent witness still carrying the potential to break the silence that had stretched from 1983. In 2018, when trace DNA analysis technology began to be widely implemented in forensic labs across the country, the Shawnee Police Department received notification from the State Technical Division about the possibility of applying methods to extract DNA from old evidence previously thought to have no value left. In the prioritized list of cold cases for review using the new technology, Camila Garcia's name surfaced again. The reason was simple. The case had multiple pieces of evidence that had close contact with the victim's body: hair clip, backpack, fabric scrap, duct tape, but over 3 decades, not a single sample had been suitable for analysis. Now, for the first time, there was a chance to extract DNA from surfaces degraded by time. The first piece of evidence selected was the hair clip found inside the red backpack discovered in 1997. According to the original file, this was the only item believed to have possibly been used by Camila before she vanished. Public opinion at the time had assumed the metal material and deteriorated plastic coating made any chance of recovering DNA virtually zero. But the new technology allowed extraction from microscopic shed skin cells, even from protein fibers that had adhered to the object over many years. The hair clip was sent for analysis at a laboratory under the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. The process was carried out with extreme caution. Surfaces were cleaned layer by layer using alternating wet-dry techniques. Enzymes were used to break down dead cell structures, and amplification machines were employed to multiply tiny DNA fragments that seemed no longer to exist. Many samples were discarded due to contamination or degradation, but after nearly 2 weeks, the technicians reported a critical result: a partial male DNA profile had been obtained. Incomplete but sufficient for preliminary analysis. The presence of male DNA completely changed the atmosphere in the cold case unit. From a file silent for 35 years, there was now evidence of a person who had been close enough to Camila's belongings to leave DNA. The investigator assigned to the file immediately compared the sample to the National CODIS database. If it matched an active criminal profile, the case could be reopened within days. But when the results came back, that hope collapsed in a single status line: no CODIS match. The DNA profile did not belong to anyone already collected in the national database. This did not rule out the possibility that the DNA belonged to the perpetrator. It only meant the man had never had a DNA sample taken in any prior case. Still, no match was better than no data at all. With the advancement of forensic genealogy, even a partial DNA sample could be used to identify family branches and narrow suspect lists. Before sending it for genealogical analysis, the technical division re-examined all evidence associated with the red backpack to ensure the DNA sample had not been contaminated during storage. The analysis report concluded that the hair clip had not been moved, improperly unsealed, or handled outside technical protocols. This ruled out contamination from anyone processing the evidence after 1997. The DNA originated from a time closest to Camila's disappearance. That knowledge made the evidence far more valuable than any investigator had ever dared hope. The investigative unit decided to send the male DNA sample to a private genealogical laboratory capable of comparing it against databases of millions of users from consumer ancestry testing services. Though expensive, this was the only opportunity to create a breakthrough in a case nearly frozen in time. While awaiting the genealogical results, the cold case team re-reviewed the 1983 and 2002 suspect lists through a fresh lens. If the DNA belonged to someone who had contact with Camila on the night she disappeared, that person would fall into one of three groups: the man standing in the parking lot, the driver of the second vehicle, or someone close enough to touch her personal items while she was being coerced. This shrank the original list of 9 suspects. 4 were quickly eliminated: 2 male customers with clear alibis, and 2 individuals who had only passed through the area. The ex-boyfriend could be fully ruled out. That left 3 whose occupations or movements fit the possibility of access to Camila. Among them, Rick Donnelly stood out most, not because of direct evidence, but because of the gaps in his old alibi. The other 2, a maintenance worker and a delivery driver, had previously had alibis confirmed, but now required re-examination under modern standards. The genealogical analysis results came back after nearly 3 months. They did not provide an individual name, but they identified a related genetic surname group connected to the found DNA profile. This was not enough to pinpoint an identity, but it was enough to eliminate tens of thousands of unrelated people. The report narrowed the suspect pool to 3 individuals in the central Shawnee area, all belonging to technical or mechanical labor professions. When investigators matched those 3 names against the old list, they realized only one had been on the original suspect list, had once owned a 1978 van, had been cleared from the file too early, based on hard-to-verify statements, and had been seen around Sooner Stop multiple times. But at this moment, they drew no conclusions. Everything was recorded in one short line in the internal report: case shows new DNA data. For the first time, there is a basis to consider solving the case with new technology. After 35 years in the shadows, Camila Garcia's seemingly useless hair clip had opened the first small door, revealing the possibility that her mysterious disappearance was no longer permanently locked in the cold case cabinet. There was still no incriminating evidence against anyone, no identity, no answers, but for the first time since 1983, a real ray of hope began to take shape. In 2025, the genealogical DNA analysis report sent from the private laboratory created the breakthrough that investigators had waited decades for. The male DNA sample found on Camila Garcia's hair clip had a genetic connection to the Donnelly family branch, a lineage scattered across central and eastern Oklahoma for multiple generations. This was not an exact match, but the degree of genetic similarity was sufficient to determine that the man who left the DNA belonged to this branch, or was closely related to it. The expanded genealogical map provided by the laboratory included a long list of individuals sharing common ancestors, but the number of people living in or near Shawnee in 1983 narrowed down to just 4 names, one of whom had been on the original suspect list, Rick Donnelly. When the investigative team reread Rick's file from the early years of the case, they realized it was nearly empty. Only a few summarized lines about the alibi, provided by relatives, and a note added when the file went cold case, not involved. 10 years after Rick's old van was found with the duct tape fragment and green fabric scrap, the genealogical factor now made that name stand out above all others. The investigator assigned to the file requested a complete review of Rick Donnelly's personal history, from residence, employment, to any relevant events in the period before and after Camila's disappearance. Checking local court records revealed a forgotten report from 1981, in which a woman had accused Rick of assaulting her while both were working on an electrical repair project. The file noted that the woman escaped, reported it to police, but the case never went to prosecution, because the victim refused to continue as a witness. At the time, Rick had no prior record, and authorities recorded the incident only as an isolated report. However, in the context of the Camila Garcia case, the 1981 event took on entirely different significance. It was the first evidence reflecting a pattern of sexually motivated violent behavior. This was documented in the 2025 report as a particularly important behavioral risk factor. As the scope of review expanded, investigators continued to discover that Rick had been present near Sooner Stop multiple times during the month Camila disappeared. Several old work tickets from the electric company recorded him repairing wiring systems for 2 buildings just a few hundred meters from Sooner Stop. Although the tickets did not specify exact hours, Rick's location and timing were close enough to the disappearance area to make the investigative team pause and reconsider. This coincidence did not prove criminal activity, but it sharply increased the probability that he could have approached Camila on the night she vanished. Behavioral psychological analysis from invited experts also revealed a dangerous pattern. Rick had a job that allowed flexible movement around town, access to young women in low-traffic areas, and a prior accusation of controlling violent behavior. When pieced together, these elements began to form a plausible motive for Camila's disappearance. According to the report, Rick shared common traits with perpetrator profiles in abductions of young women during that era: tendency toward control, past coercive behavior, ability to approach victims without drawing attention, and capacity to dispose of evidence using work vehicles. The investigative team reopened the evaluation of Rick's old alibi, once considered solid. When cross-checking the 1983 statements from his brother and neighbor, the faded memories and absence of physical corroboration rendered those accounts no longer legally sufficient. No garage repair receipts, no objective data records, not even the neighbor's sighting of Rick fully aligned with the disappearance timeframe. What had once been treated as an alibi now became gaps. When investigators pulled up the summary board, they saw that all the new chains of evidence circled around Rick: the genealogical DNA pointing to the Donnelly surname, the history of an assault accusation, presence near Camila's disappearance site, ownership of an old truck or van, the duct tape and green fabric clues in the 1978 van. No one else on the old suspect list possessed the full set of matching characteristics. The investigative team posed the pivotal question: if Rick had approached Camila, did he have the opportunity to carry out the act without being seen? The answer lay right in the file's chain of leads: the dark unlit stretch of road, the second vehicle, the low-traffic Sooner Stop parking lot late at night, and the blind spot where the K9 scent trail ended. All these elements showed the perpetrator could act undetected, especially if familiar with the area and knowing the best places to hide. After 2 months of review, the final analysis report of 2025 concluded Rick Donnelly was officially returned to primary suspect status, not because of direct incriminating evidence, but because the entire array of new leads, from genealogical DNA to behavioral history and access to Camila, converged on one direction. Placing Rick back as a primary suspect opened a series of new tasks: monitoring his recent activities, obtaining a direct DNA sample for comparison with the trace DNA from the hair clip, and re-examining his full vehicle, employment, personal and financial records over the years. To avoid alerting the subject, the Shawnee Police Department and OSBI jointly issued a covert surveillance order. Investigators were assigned to observe Rick's daily life discreetly, avoiding direct contact. They checked his residence, monitored work hours, identified personal relationships, friends and colleagues, while looking for any signs that Rick might have engaged in similar behavior in the past that went undetected. The special surveillance team was also required to trace any information on vehicles Rick owned after the 1978 van, in case other evidence had once existed. All actions were carried out cautiously, because any mistake in surveillance could jeopardize the chance for direct DNA comparison. While technical teams conducted deeper analysis on old evidence using improved extraction methods, field investigators persisted in daily monitoring of Rick. After more than 40 years of silence, that name was once again at the center of a case no one in Shawnee ever thought would move again. And this time, every fact was illuminated under new light, the light of forensic genealogy, the technology capable of seeing connections that paper files had missed for decades. The covert surveillance order lasted several months, allowing the investigative team to gather enough baseline data to present to the court for a search warrant on the old garage behind Rick Donnelly's house, a structure that had existed since the 1970s, previously used by Rick for small repair jobs. When the judge signed the warrant, the investigative team executed the search early one morning, while Rick was working at a job site nearly 20 miles away. The garage had a tin roof, old rotting wooden doors, and a thick layer of accumulated dust, as if no one had touched it in years. However, investigators did not trust that surface silence. Many perpetrators have the habit of keeping items related to past acts as a form of memory control. Upon entering, the examination team noted the interior filled with boxes of electrical components, rusted cables, several disassembled devices, and sagging wooden panels. Everything appeared old and seemingly meaningless, until one team member accidentally discovered a cylindrical paper tube wedged behind a metal crate. The paper tube was tied with thin frayed dry rope. When opened, inside was a 1983 Shawnee map. In such pristine condition, it was hard to believe it was over 4 decades old. The paper had yellowed slightly, edges faintly creased, but the lines remained clear. What drew the most attention was not the map itself, but 3 hand-drawn red circles marked in faded ink. The first circle was exactly around the area near the Tecumseh Woods, the location where Camila's left shoe was found in 1983. The second circle was on the edge of the residential area not far from Tennessee Street, matching the spot where Camila's car had been neatly placed. The third circle was in a farther southeast Shawnee area, not matching any location recorded in the file. The circles had a slight tremor in the lines, as if drawn by someone unaccustomed to marking notes, but the purpose was unmistakable. This was not an ordinary road map, but one marked for tracking, movement, or planning. Years earlier, that map might have been seen only as an old piece of paper, but in the context of the case now back in focus, its existence carried entirely different value. Investigators immediately photographed the map, sealed it, and handed it to the Criminal Analysis Group for examination. When the technical team viewed the map under angled light, they spotted faint machine oil streaks, very light, but clearly visible in elongated drop patterns, the same rare technical oil once recorded in the Sooner Stop parking lot in 1983. The repetition of that oil type could not be considered random. Only those working in electrical or industrial technical fields regularly used similar oil. No extensive cross-checking was needed. Investigators understood this could be the first physical link in the file, showing an item in Rick's possession might have been carried during the same period as the disappearance. The report noted, oil type consistent with sample collected in 1983, map likely stored in garage or technical vehicle around that same time. Upon closer analysis, the investigative team discovered the map had been folded in the distinctive creases typical of maps carried in vehicles, rather than wall-hung maps. This fit perfectly with Rick once driving the 1978 Chevrolet van, a vehicle with enough space to keep a map in a side compartment or clipped under a seat. If the map had been in the vehicle during 1983, it explained why technical oil streaks appeared on the paper surface. The oil could have transferred from hands or a tool in the vehicle. The first 2 circles matched the 2 evidence locations found over the past 40 years. That was what made the investigative team pause in silence for several minutes. No one would have reason to circle those 2 locations in 1983, unless those locations played a role in the movements of someone connected to the disappearance. Investigators asked, who would circle these areas if the person had no connection to the case? There was no reasonable answer other than the person drawing the circles knew of those locations' existence in the criminal act or in planning the movements. The third circle, the position never mentioned in the file, opened an entirely new direction for the case. According to current cadastral maps, those coordinates lay near a small, long-abandoned wooded area. The investigative team noted that area as a priority for survey in the next steps. When all data from the garage was collected, the investigative team began building a time-location linkage chart. On the left side of the chart were the 3 circled locations on the map, On the right were Rick's presence timelines. Just in the month Camila disappeared, the number of times Rick appeared near the marked points was far too many to dismiss as coincidence. When adding the detail that the 1978 van once owned by Rick contained duct tape and green fabric matching scattered evidence in the case, the 1983 map became the final logical piece in a chain no longer fragmented. A veteran investigator said during the summary meeting, "If this is just coincidence, then it's the biggest coincidence in Shawnee investigative history." No one contradicted, no one downplayed that map. It was not merely an old sheet of paper, it was evidence speaking for the past, evidence Rick Donnelly never imagined would one day be unearthed from his own rotting garage. And for the first time, signs of the true route in Camila Garcia's case had opened before the investigative team, clearer than any hypothesis in the past 4 decades. When the information about the 1983 map was analyzed and incorporated into the internal report, OSBI received an unusual call from an elderly man living in Tulsa. He introduced himself in a trembling voice, saying he had worked at a small car wash in Shawnee the year Camila Garcia disappeared. He stated clearly, "I think it's time to tell what I saw. I don't want to take it to the grave with me." That opening prompted the OSBI investigator to immediately schedule him for an official statement at the office. The man entered the interview room, carrying the tension of someone who had held a secret for nearly 4 decades. He explained that toward the end of August 1983, just one day after Camila went missing, Rick Donnelly brought his 1978 Chevrolet van to the car wash where he worked at the time. What stood out was not the car wash itself, but Rick's request, "Make it really clean. Clean the inside too. The faster the better. I'll pay extra." That was the only time during his employment that he saw Rick arrive with such urgency and tension. At the time the car washer didn't think much of it. The incident only became memorable because Rick stood several steps away from the vehicle, constantly glancing around as if afraid someone might come close. When asked for more details, he recounted that when he opened the van door, the smell of technical oil was very noticeable. He remembered it because the car wash back then didn't use that type of oil, and its smell was quite distinctive. It was like the industrial oil I'd seen a few times when helping electricians in the shop, he said. That detail matched strikingly with the oil trace analysis results from days earlier, the rare oil used only by electricians or technical workers. The man continued describing that the floor mats were extremely dirty, as if something heavy had been dragged or something with hard edges had been pulled across them. He couldn't confirm what it was, but he clearly remembered Rick instructing him not to vacuum the rear seats, saying he would clean that part himself. This was unusual behavior, because most customers wanted the rear seats cleaned more thoroughly than the front. When the investigator asked why he had stayed silent for 40 years, he grew quiet, then explained that after finishing the wash, Rick returned to the car wash that evening. He didn't smile, didn't greet like he had in the morning. He just looked straight at the car washer with heavy eyes. Rick spoke softly but firmly. "What happened this morning? Best if you don't tell anyone. Some things once said are hard to take back." The man, only in his early 20s at the time, understood the threat immediately. Small town, unstable job, he didn't want trouble. Plus, there was no confirmation that the vehicle was connected to the disappearance, so he chose silence, thinking time would eventually wash away the worry, but it didn't disappear. It only sank deeper, and waited for the right moment to resurface. The investigator asked if he remembered any other signs inside the vehicle. He said, "I remember a very small piece of green fabric caught under the seat, but when I touched it, it tore right away. I thought it was just some old rag." The statement made the entire room seem to hold its breath. The green fabric scrap had been found near Camila's left shoe. Another piece was discovered in the van in 2011. Now, a third witness had spoken of the same type of fabric, in the same location, at the same time. When cross-referenced with the file, OSBI noted immediately, "Witness statement corroborates previous physical evidence." The man further confirmed that the timing of Rick bringing the van in was the morning after news reports began broadcasting Camila's disappearance. This showed the vehicle cleaning occurred immediately, as if Rick wanted to erase traces from the vehicle as quickly as possible. When asked if he had seen blood or anything else unusual, he answered no, but he emphasized what he remembered most. Rick carried a face not like the Rick of ordinary days, not calm, not polite, but tightly wound, like someone who had just gone through something that needed to be hidden. The investigative team did not treat this statement as standalone evidence, but in criminal investigations, witness testimony carries special value when it aligns with physical evidence the witness never had access to. The man had never known about the green fabric scrap from 1983, never known about the red backpack from 1997, never heard that the duct tape found in the van in 2011 was connected to the case. Yet the three details he described, the rare machine oil smell, the green fabric scrap, the rushed cleaning behavior, all fit perfectly with evidence collected over 4 decades. The OSBI investigator wrote in the report, "Statement confirms evidence disposal behavior, level of consistency with existing facts, exceeds coincidence probability." At the end of the interview, the man said one sentence that left the room silent. "I don't know what Rick did, but I know for sure he wanted to wipe something clean from that vehicle, and I believe it was connected to the missing girl." After 40 years, a final witness had stepped out of the shadows. His statement not only filled gaps in the file, but connected the scattered pieces into a clear behavioral pattern. Rick Donnelly had tried to erase traces from the van on the very night Camila Garcia disappeared. When the new witness statement from 1983 was incorporated into the evaluation, OSBI shifted its entire focus to finding an irrefutable physical link, something the investigative forces had never possessed throughout 4 decades. The garage behind Rick Donnelly's house was researched using the new trace technology, this time with meticulous attention down to every speck of dust. Technicians overlooked no spot, door crevices, wooden hinges, old tin strips, steel frame joints. Wherever microscopic material could possibly remain, they examined it with angled lighting, magnifying glasses, and spectral filtering equipment. While scrutinizing close to the garage door edge, a forensic technician discovered an extremely thin paint streak, so small that without special angled illumination, it would have looked no different from a silver speck of dust. The streak was lodged in the wooden groove right beside the hinge, as though it had been scraped and shattered into tiny fragments. The sample was collected with a micro swab, placed in a sealed container, and immediately sent to the laboratory for chemical composition analysis. The results brought the entire group to a halt. The pigment composition, metal ratio, solvent and polymer form in the paint layer matched exactly with the residual paint sample still remaining on Camila Garcia's car door, collected in 1983. It wasn't just similar type of paint, it matched down to the same production batch, metallic paint imported from Michigan, which existed on the market for only slightly more than 1 year. The manufacturer's report confirmed only 3 shipments carried that rare pigment ratio. The probability of coincidence was extremely low. No one in Shawnee was recorded as owning a vehicle with that same paint line except Camila. A tiny paint fragment found in Rick's garage directly connected his private space with the vehicle the victim had used. In forensic terms, this was no longer a suggestive clue, it was evidence of physical interaction. While one group analyzed the paint, another forensic team continued cross-referencing the silver duct tape recovered from the 1978 Chevrolet van, once owned by Rick, with the roll of tape found in the red backpack in 1997. The new technology allowed analysis of polymer fiber structure, adhesive layer thickness, additives, and backing weave pattern. The 2 tape samples, appearing in 2 different contexts, nearly 3 decades apart, produced results that matched almost perfectly the same industrial-grade product line sold only to electrical technical units during the 1981 to 1984 period. This was not a type of tape ordinary people could buy in regular hardware stores, it was specialized for electricians, the profession Rick pursued for many years. The fact that 2 pieces of evidence from the same rare product line, one appearing in a backpack suspected to be linked to Camila, the other appearing in Rick's own vehicle, created a coincidence too strong to dismiss. When the 2 independent forensic results, the paint streak and the duct tape were placed side by side, Every analysis began to coalesce into a clear behavioral pattern. If the paint streak indicated that Camila's car door had once collided with a wooden or metal surface in Rick's garage or vehicle, then the duct tape showed that restraint tools had been used during contact between Camila and the perpetrator. Added to that was the 1983 witness statement describing Rick bringing the vehicle for urgent cleaning, requesting interior detailing, instructing to skip the rear seat area, along with the rare machine oil smell, type found both on the 1983 map and in the parking lot where Camila disappeared. No element in this chain stood alone. When strung together, they formed an undeniable shape. Rick's vehicle played a central role in Camila's disappearance. Her car had made contact with it, Rick's duct tape matched the line found in the backpack, and the rushed cleaning of the vehicle, the morning after, aligned with evidence disposal behavior in many abduction cases. The forensic file described the level of linkage in a way that left no gaps. Paint streak carries unique characteristics, impossible to originate from another vehicle. Duct tape origin matches at polymer level, rare type, probability of the two tape samples appearing independently is extremely low. Behavioral data fits post-attack evidence, erasure pattern. When the analysis team reconstructed the sequence of the night Camila disappeared, the pattern emerged clearer than ever. Camila stepped into the blind zone between the store and the residential area. Rick approached from the parking lot side. She was forced toward the van. Camila's car door struck a hard surface, creating the paint transfer. Duct tape was used for restraint. The shoe fell during movement. Evidence scattered along the path, and the next morning, Rick attempted to erase traces before search efforts expanded. In the meeting at OSBI, when the forensic expert presented the final conclusion, the entire room nearly held its breath. He spoke slowly, clearly, adding no unnecessary words. The physical linkage is fully determinative. The forensic indicators cannot be explained by an innocent scenario. This was no longer a chain of inferences based on isolated suspicions. This was the combination of scientific data, behavioral patterns, witness testimony, and trace evidence, pieces no longer scattered, but layered over one another, fitting detail by detail, each strengthening the one before it. As soon as the full forensic reports were received, OSBI prepared the emergency arrest warrant application for Rick Donnelly. The court filing included the entire body of evidence, the absolute paint match, the rare industrial-grade duct tape match, the 40-year silent witness statement, the marked 1983 map, with machine oil traces, the 1981 violent behavior history, Rick's presence locations during Camila's disappearance window, and the genealogical data confirming direct contact probability. The judge requested a second independent analysis of the paint streak to ensure no technical error. The results reconfirmed the original conclusion with perfect alignment. After overall review, the emergency arrest warrant was approved. The covert investigative team, having monitored Rick for months, received deployment orders. No announcement, no alerting, no opportunity for the subject to destroy further evidence. Science had spoken its part, and now, the justice system would proceed with the rest. Rick Donnelly was brought into the interview room. That same afternoon, the arrest warrant was executed. The small room, cold white lights, simple metal table, all created an atmosphere that allowed no retreat. Rick sat there, hands clasped together, eyes not meeting anyone directly, his face trying to maintain calm, but unable to hide the tension in his jawline. The investigators began with basic questions: residence, job in 1983, any relationship with Camila Garcia. Rick denied everything. He said he had never met Camila, never been near Sooner Stop on the night she disappeared, never had any contact with her car. His voice was steady, trying to stay calm, but the investigators had seen many people in similar situations, and that steadiness was not a sign of innocence. It was the sign of someone who had prepared answers in advance. When the free-form dialogue ended, the investigator placed the evidence box on the table, slowly, deliberately, and began opening each sealed envelope. First came the enlarged photo of the microscopic paint transfer. Rick glanced at it, then immediately looked away. The investigator asked, "How do you explain paint from Camila's car being found in your garage?" Rick replied with the familiar line, "I don't know anything about that, but the words came with quickened breathing, no longer carrying the certainty of earlier. The investigator didn't argue, just placed the second envelope on the table, the silver duct tape fragment, one from the van Rick once owned, one from Camila's backpack. This time, they said nothing, letting Rick look long enough to understand there was no way back. When asked if he recognized that type of tape, Rick swallowed, then said quietly, "That kind is used in the electrical trade." The investigator nodded, then gently asked, "You used it in your van, didn't you?" Rick didn't answer. A long silence filled the room. The investigator changed tactics, not pressing, not threatening, just calmly recounting each fact: the witness statement about Rick bringing the vehicle for urgent cleaning, the marked map, the green fabric scrap, and finally, the genealogical DNA results. They didn't accuse Rick of being the perpetrator. They only asked, "Are you really saying all of this is coincidence?" Rick was no longer staring at the table. He looked straight at the investigator, but the defensiveness in his eyes from the beginning was gone, replaced only by the weary resistance of someone who knew he could no longer escape the tightening grip of evidence. The investigator placed the final photo in front of Rick, an image of Camila Garcia, at 19 years old, not to accuse, but to pull him out of the loop of meaningless denials. "You say you never met her," the investigator said, "but every piece of evidence leads back to your vehicle. If you didn't put her in that van, then who did?" Rick closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging as though releasing something that had weighed on him for years. His voice came out hoarse, barely louder than a breath. "I put her in the van." The investigators didn't interrupt, didn't cheer, didn't press further. They let Rick speak, but Rick didn't continue. He didn't describe what happened in the van, didn't say how Camila was coerced, didn't say what led to her permanent disappearance. When the investigator asked, "What happened after you put her in the van?" Rick shook his head, slowly but firmly. "I'm not saying anything more." He repeated that sentence 4 times, not denying, but refusing to tell the rest. That was not innocence. It was the desperate defense of someone who knew any additional detail could turn a serious charge into one with no escape. The investigator tried shifting direction by asking about the map, about the parking lot, about why Rick cleaned the vehicle so urgently the next morning. Every question was blocked by the single phrase, "I'm not saying anything more." But even though Rick said nothing further, that partial admission already crossed the minimum threshold to constitute criminal liability. The law doesn't require the perpetrator to recount the entire act. Only a confession that the victim was placed in the vehicle under coercive circumstances, combined with strong physical evidence, is sufficient to support serious charges. The investigators concluded the interview by rereading legal rights and officially recording. Rick Donnelly confirmed that Camila Garcia had been in his van on the night she disappeared. No innocent explanation could cover that statement. In legal terms, some small admissions carry more weight than lengthy confessions, and this was one of them. After the interview, OSBA's legal division held an emergency meeting to finalize the charging document. The evidence was arranged in logical order: trace physical evidence, genealogical DNA results, the car wash witness statement, the 1983 marked map, green fabric scraps, silver duct tape, and finally Rick's admission. All of it combined to form a tightly structured prosecution file that fully met the standards for submission to state court. No coercion, no psychological traps, no full confession needed, just one sentence. "I put her in the van," was enough to break through the wall of defense Rick had built for 4 decades. And with that sentence, the Camila Garcia case was officially no longer an unsolved mystery. This was the point where the investigation shifted from seeking truth to preparing for justice. Rick Donnelly was escorted out of the interview room and taken directly to the Pottawatomie County Jail to await formal charging proceedings. The indictment was presented in court the following morning, with the 2 most serious charges under Oklahoma law: kidnapping and murder in the first degree. Even though Camila Garcia's body was never found, the prosecution believed that the cumulative evidence, gathered over 4 decades, had finally crossed the threshold required to form a complete no-body homicide, a rare but entirely legal pattern when sufficient physical, behavioral, and circumstantial evidence exists. The court set a trial date, and over the following weeks, the state prosecutor's office and the OSBI team prepared the most comprehensive presentation in the history of Oklahoma cold cases. The centerpiece of the case was not Rick's partial admission, but the tightly closed chain of physical evidence built with modern forensics: the microscopic paint transfer match, the rare duct tape, the genealogical DNA sample, the marked map, the car wash witness statement, the machine oil traces, and the inexplicable connection between Rick's van and the scattered evidence along Camila's path of disappearance. In the trial, the prosecution opened with a clear statement: "We do not need to find a body to prove a murder. We only need to prove that the victim could not still be alive, and that the defendant was the only person with the means, opportunity, and behavior consistent with the crime pattern." From there, they constructed a sequential argument, guiding the jury through each piece of the puzzle. First came the paint transfer, a single sample matching exactly with the paint layer on Camila's car door. The forensic expert explained that the rare metallic pigment ratio in the paint allowed them to completely rule out random occurrence in Rick's garage. He stated, "No other vehicle in Shawnee in 1983 carried this paint, except Camila Garcia's car." Next was the industrial duct tape, a type distributed only to electrical technical businesses. 2 samples, separated by nearly 3 decades, taken from 2 independent locations, the van Rick once owned and Camila's backpack. The polymer analysis expert took the stand and demonstrated that the microscopic structure of the 2 tape pieces matched so closely that they could only have come from the same supply chain. Then came the car wash witness, who had remained silent for 40 years out of fear. He described Rick bringing the vehicle to the wash the morning after Camila disappeared, demanding quick interior cleaning, prohibiting anyone from touching the rear seats, and arriving with a vehicle that smelled strongly of rare technical oil. Those statements were corroborated by physical evidence: the green fabric in the van, the machine oil on the map, and the fit with evidence disposal patterns in abductions of that era. The prosecution continued by presenting the 1983 Shawnee map, found in Rick's garage. On it were 3 red circles, 2 of which matched locations where Camila's evidence was discovered: the Tecumseh Woods and the area near Tennessee Street. The rare machine oil streaks on the map created a direct link between the time of the disappearance and the place the map was stored. When presenting the DNA, the prosecution did not claim Rick left the biological sample, but emphasized that the male DNA on the hair clip belonged to the Donnelly family lineage, narrowing the pool to 3 men living in the area in 1983, and of those 3, only Rick had owned a 1978 van, had been seen around Sooner Stop, had faced an assault accusation in 1981, and had taken his vehicle to be cleaned the morning after. A crucial part of the trial was the timeline the prosecution reconstructed. They presented the jury with a chart cross-referencing Rick's 1983 alibi statements against the new facts. Discrepancies stood out clearly. The neighbor was uncertain about the exact time he saw Rick, the brothers' work notes did not match the hour, and Rick's logged location in the electric company records placed him right near Sooner Stop at the time Camila left the store. When the prosecution asked Rick to explain these discrepancies, he only said one sentence: "I don't remember." That answer only thickened the cloud of suspicion. The defense attempted to break the forensic pattern by arguing that evidence could have been cross-contaminated over years of storage, but forensic experts immediately rebutted with analysis results confirming that all trace samples retained their temporal markers, with no signs of later handling. They tried arguing that Rick's partial admission could not be considered direct evidence, but the prosecution countered by pointing out that the case rested on a chain of forensic and behavioral links, not on a single confession. The interrogation video was played, showing Rick's admission: "I put her in the van." The jury saw that moment, heard the tone of his voice, and immediately understood the weight of those words. The trial lasted several days, with hundreds of pages of forensic evidence, 3D models simulating the paint transfer collision, polymer analysis charts, diagrams of movement around the Sooner Stop area, and independent witness reports. When both sides concluded their arguments, the jury retired for deliberation for only a short time, a familiar sign in cases where the evidence is overwhelmingly clear. When they returned to the courtroom, no one looked toward Rick. The judge asked the foreperson, "Have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The answer came firmly, without hesitation or division. "Yes, Your Honor." Rick Donnelly was found guilty on all counts, guilty of both charges, kidnapping and murder in the first degree. No body was found, but science was. No direct eyewitness existed, but a closed chain of evidence did. No full confession was given, but a clear collapse of denial occurred under the weight of proof. The sentence was pronounced in silence, and with that verdict, the Camila Garcia case, which had seemed destined to remain buried forever in cold case storage, reached its conclusion in the criminal court of 2025. The sentence was pronounced at the end of the trial on an unusually quiet fall morning in the Pottawatomie County Courthouse. As the judge rose to read the penalty, no one in the courtroom stirred. Not from surprise, every piece of evidence had pointed to this long before, but from the feeling that a final door was about to close after 42 years. Rick Donnelly was sentenced to 45 years in prison, with no possibility of parole, no early release, under the sentencing guidelines for kidnapping and murder in the first degree. The sentence did not rest on a complete confession, but on a unified, seamless chain of evidence: the microscopic paint transfer match, the rare duct tape, the genealogical DNA sample, evidence from the backpack, the green fabric scraps, the marked map, the urgent vehicle cleaning traces, the witness who remained silent for 40 years, and the inconsistent behavior during interrogation. All of it converged into an undeniable story, the story Rick had tried to conceal for more than half his life. In the courtroom, Rick remained silent. He did not shout, did not object, did not ask to make a final statement. He only looked down at his clasped hands, as if he knew every path had been sealed shut the moment the paint sample was analyzed, the moment the duct tape was traced, the moment he admitted, "I put her in the van." That was the point where the law no longer permitted any avenue of escape. After the sentence was handed down, OSB held an official press conference, as required for long-standing cold cases, resolved through modern technology. On the podium, an OSBI representative presented a summary file, hundreds of pages long, describing the entire 42-year process of solving the case, from the raw leads in 1983, through discrepancies in witness statements, decades of deadlock, then the revival of clues with the red backpack in 1997, the reopening in 2002, the tracing of the 1978 van, the emergence of trace DNA, the genealogical analysis in 2018 and 2025, the car wash witness statement, the map in the garage, and finally, the forensic conclusions that created the decisive turning point. Each element was presented as a step in the investigative ladder, a journey where technology, persistence and file preservation together reconstructed the truth. The investigating agency publicly announced that this was one of the most significant no-body homicides ever successfully solved in the state's history, not because of the complexity of the crime itself, but because of the sheer thickness of time and the absence of a body factors that had once doomed many cases to permanent impasse. They emphasized that the Camila Garcia case had become a complete example of advances in forensic science and the decisive role of forensic genealogy in the 21st century. The official OSBA report summarized 3 major operational lessons that enabled the resolution of this case after more than 4 decades. 1. Forensic genealogy is an irreplaceable tool for solving long-term cold cases. The male DNA sample, recovered from the hair clip, an item long thought useless, decayed and meaningless, became the key that unlocked the case from stasis. No complete sample, no CODIS match needed, only tracing the family lineage was enough to narrow suspects from tens of thousands down to 3. A method once considered far-fetched has now become a core foundation in cases without a body or without direct perpetrator DNA. 2. Evidence preservation is the decisive factor. Not every piece of evidence remained pristine, but the forgotten hair clip in the backpack had been properly sealed in 1997. The dust-sized paint fragment in the garage survived because the space had not been heavily renovated. The faded, dried duct tape roll in the backpack still retained enough polymer markers for analysis. If any one of these pieces had been destroyed, contaminated, or stored improperly, the entire forensic chain would have broken. The Camila Garcia case stands as a textbook example that even seemingly minor evidence, when properly preserved, can carry the full weight of justice. 3. Alibi verification must rely on independent data, not single statements alone. Rick's 1983 alibi was once deemed solid, but it rested entirely on family and one unverified neighbor. When re-examined, every gap in timing, every vagueness in memory, every mismatch with his work itinerary exposed the truth that alibi had never truly existed. This is the single most important operational lesson OSBA presented to investigative units. Every alibi must be corroborated by at least 2 independent sources of data to avoid allowing a case to veer off course for decades due to early-stage leniency. When OSBA reviewed the entire case-solving process, all data was cross-checked to ensure the file left no loose ends. From forensic conclusions to behavioral mapping, from timelines to evidence locations, from witness statements to subject history, everything connected into a single unbroken network, confirming that the case had been resolved to its final point. And then, for the first time since the day Camila Garcia disappeared, the words her family had waited decades to hear were finally spoken. The case file of Camila Garcia is officially closed. No unfinished hypotheses, no suspects left unexamined, no leads left to pursue, no questions without answers. When the final stamp came down, everyone in the OSBA briefing room understood that this case had become part of investigative history, not because of its brutality, but because of the 42-year journey that brought truth out of darkness and back into light. Rick Donnelly, the man who hid behind lies for a lifetime, received a 45-year sentence with no parole. Camila Garcia, though never found, finally received justice. The case is officially closed. The story of Camila Garcia and the 42-year journey to solve her case precisely reflects what American society still faces today: violence against young women, gaps in initial investigations, the prolonged silence of witnesses due to fear of retaliation, and the vital importance of modern forensic science. Looking back at every detail, the dust-sized paint fleck caught in a garage groove, the specialized duct tape not sold retail, the hair clip preserved for decades, or the half-spoken admission "I put her in the van," we see a clear lesson truth sometimes hides, not in grand things, but in fragments society casually overlooks. In today's America, where crimes targeting women remain a painful issue, the story reminds us that personal vigilance is never excessive. Camila was approached in an area only a few dozen steps from the store, a blind zone that exists in any American town. The lesson here: no one is completely safe, and understanding one's surroundings, avoiding walking alone in low-light areas, or informing loved ones of travel plans are practical steps every citizen should take. The story also sends Americans a reminder of communal responsibility. The car wash witness stayed silent for 40 years out of fear, and that silence inadvertently extended the case by 4 decades. In modern society, reporting suspicious behavior, assisting law enforcement, or speaking up when danger signs appear is not only a legal duty, it is an act that can save a life. Finally, the story underscores a critical professional lesson for American law enforcement: alibis must be verified, evidence must be preserved, and forensic genealogy is no longer a supplementary tool, but a cornerstone of modern investigation. When communities are more vigilant, witnesses are braver, and the justice system is more persistent, tragedies like Camila Garcia's will have fewer chances to repeat. If you want to keep following tenacious journeys like Camila Garcia's and the power of science in solving cases, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a story. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video, where we continue to explore how justice is reclaimed even from the deepest shadows.